So, Mesdames, Messieurs, welcome to our webinar called today Between War and Decarbonization, What Does the Concept of Energy Security Mean for the North Atlantic Area? And so this webinar is part of a series of webinars organized in cooperation between the FRS and the US Embassy and Consulate in France. So I would like already to thank them very warmly actually for that. And maybe before getting in the heart of the matter, I would like to give the floor to Mr. Lawrence Randolph, your Minister Counselor of the Public Affairs at the US Embassy in Paris for some opening remarks. So please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Annabelle. I'm very much comfortable with people calling me Laurence. It happens a lot here in France. So I'm Lawrence Randolph, or Laurence. I'm the Minister Counselor for Public Affairs here at the US Embassy in Paris. And it's a great pleasure to welcome such a large group of specialists. Today for this webinar, we have 3 experts today who will talk to you about decarbonization. So as you know, the topic is between war and decarbonization. What does the concept of energy security mean in the North Atlantic area? It's also a great privilege to be partnered with the Foundation for Strategic Research. We have a long-standing relationship with the Foundation, and we really partner together to bring American perspectives to French audiences and encourage dialogue between our 2 people. So the United States is committed to European energy security and advancing global energy security by accelerating manufacturing and deployment of clean energy sources and technologies, including electric vehicles, battery storage, offshore wind, nuclear energy, and clean hydrogen, and driving innovation in energy efficiency and productivity improvements. Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine illustrates the imperative to accelerate the energy transition and improve our energy efficiency, diversify suppliers, and to shift to clean energy as quickly as possible. This is the best way to bolster energy security in the medium and long term. Clean energy is secure energy. The United States is working with the G7 and other allies and partners on mechanisms such as the oil price cap to stabilize energy prices, while at the same time reducing the earnings that Russia receives for its energy exports, which help finance its unjustified war in Ukraine. Over time, the energy transition will advance our economic and national security. Done right, the energy transition will transform global geopolitics. The United States and our allies and partners in Europe and elsewhere must seize the opportunity to lead this transition together, drawing on each other's capacity for research and innovation. And this year specifically, as we celebrate the 80th anniversary of the liberation of France and Europe, we remember the strong historical basis for this collaboration and for really all that unites us. Again, today, the United States and our allies and partners in Europe and elsewhere must seize the opportunity to lead this transition together, drawing on each other's capacity for research and innovation. So I am going to leave the floor now back to our moderator, Annabelle Livet, and thank you all again for your participation today.
Many thanks, Lawrence. I get it. And it's actually my great pleasure to moderate this webinar. And as you already mentioned, so I'm actually a research fellow at the FRS. So the Fondation for Strategic Research, maybe for those who doesn't know us, we are an independent and apolitical think tank based in Paris, and we are mostly focused on security and defense issues, and therefore, of course, energy security is part of it. And maybe to contextualize a little bit, it's about, as you already mentioned, energy supply issues have also reemerged quite strongly in a highly geopolitical context. And actually, this context has underlined imbalances and vulnerabilities of the current domestic energy mixes. And at the same time, decarbonization efforts, as you mentioned, Lawrence, must be maintained, which may offer at some points some opportunities. And in the same time, they also highlight other geopolitical dimension. And some would even talk about actually geo-economic dimensions. The fact is that actually in this energy situation, the North Atlantic region is linked. And this must be said as well, that actually when we are talking about energy security, it doesn't necessarily mean the same depending on the countries. It is a fact actually within Europe, and also more than surely actually in the North Atlantic area. So therefore, I'm more than delighted actually to be with our excellent panelists who will deliver us precious insights from their perspectives. So, Madam Jane Nakano, good morning to you once more. You logged from Washington, D.C., and therefore it's a great pleasure to have you here. And you are senior fellow, at the CSIS, so Center for Strategic and International Studies. And also a very warm welcome to Loyle Campbell from Berlin this time. And you are a research fellow at the DGAP, so the German Council for Foreign Affairs, to give us, of course, more details about from the German perspective. And last but certainly least, I'm very happy to have you, Nicolas Mazzucchi, on board with us. You are research director at the French Navy Center for Strategic Studies, and finally, and actually based quite in the middle between Washington, D.C. and Berlin, so namely Paris. So I'm very excited to hear your presentations, and maybe for the audience, it will take so. We will have firstly some different presentation from our speakers, and after this, we will open to a discussion with you. So if you have any questions, feel free actually to ask them directly in the dedicated Q&A section, and then we will pick up just afterwards. So maybe to start, if you agree with Loyle, we could begin with you, because of course, since the beginning of the war in Ukraine, Germany has been heavily affected by the resulting energy crisis. So maybe we can hear a little bit more details, your inputs on it. I give you the floor.
Yeah, thank you very much, Annabelle. I really appreciate the opportunity to be here, and thank you as well to the U.S. Embassy for helping host this event, and for my co-panelists. I'm very excited to hear your thoughts. I guess it goes fitting that Germany goes first, because Germany's strategic issues and energy policy have largely been one of the major drivers behind the crisis and the current position. Going forward, I will be discussing pre-war Germany and kind of what that looks like very briefly. We are very familiar with it, but I think refreshing the numbers can kind of help give an overview. And then I'll be discussing the immediate response to the invasion of Ukraine and what that looked like within the short first year of the so-called Zeitenwende, and what the first year in Ukraine looked like, and what the situation is more recently, like within the past 6 months, and how that has evolved, and how momentum kind of appears to be shifting from one reason or another. And then I'll be addressing the questions that were raised by our wonderful hosts. So pre-war German energy security is very, very well understood. The Energiewende from the early 2000s and 2010s, transitioning away from nuclear energy was a major point of this. Gradually shifting away from German lignite coal and otherwise was a major part of this. But Nord Stream 1, Nord Stream 2, and heavy reliance on Russian gas was essentially the backbone of this, in conjunction with deployment of more and more renewables. The graph on the left from Statista shows that in 2020, Germany received 55% of its natural gas directly from Russia via pipelines. This is very well known, but it shows the scale of the dependency. But the interesting caveats are that at the same time, Poland was very, very hawkish on Russian gas, and so were the Baltic states. So the interesting things here is the German government and German political leaders were extremely critical of the hawkish position being taken by their eastern neighbors, and they're very critical of LNG capacity. And again, right before the war began, as troops were amassing in Belarus and on the Ukrainian border, there was U.S. intelligence leaks saying that there is this invasion plan. The Germans, up until the very last minute, were still calling Nord Stream 1 and Nord Stream 2 economic tools, and were still saying the American position was hawkish until they crossed the border directly. They were essentially, you can essentially see that there is this strong, deeply entrenched ordoliberal conservatism that really, really believes in the primacy of economic policy, and that economic policy determines strategic and security thought. And this is really where Germany was up until 2022. The interesting point, though, is that from February 27th, Chancellor Scholz delivered this, this is called the Zeitenwende speech, essentially pivot point, where Germany kind of has a pivot towards a more strategic self and kind of a new geopolitical era. And this quote, I'll save the reading because it's not necessary, but the major point is basically saying that Germany adopting a forward-looking energy policy is not just crucial for economic and climate, but also for national security. And you can really see this re-securitization of German energy policy. And what that looked like initially was a very, very decisive expansion of German LNG import capacity. This graph here from an article we wrote early last year essentially shows that even up to the German Climate and Economic Ministry shows that they are projected to have an overcapacity of LNG import capacity. So 20 to 30 BCM more capacity than Germany actually needs. And there is a huge margin there. 30 BCM is very, very large. This is about half as much as Russia was importing from or Germany was importing from Russia directly. So this is a very, very large surplus capacity. The idea is to have a very large security hedge. Some of the capacity will be graded for ammonia imports or green methane imports or whatever that's another separate conversation. But it also emphasizes that Germany is building out overcapacity that's intended to be kind of an alternative to pipeline gas for Central and Eastern European member states that are a little more landlocked. You can think here Slovakia, Czechia, the Czech Republic, and or Hungary, because again, having these multiple connections and expanding on German pipeline infrastructure also does make sense. So from a climate perspective, you can be critical that this, again, you're locking in more LNG import capacities that you might not need beyond 2035 or 2040 or certainly not 2050. So there is some genuine critiques of this and whether or not how fast it was moved forward, because Germany went from having zero LNG import capacity to having a very high operational capacity within 8 to 9 months, which is unheard of, especially when you're in the German context. So you can really see this being decisively moving forward. And you can see also the same kind of thing within the expansion of commitments on renewables. You can see that there was a flurry of new announcements within 2023. There was the Baltic Wind Forum, and there was another targets announced between various member states in the North Sea area. The total capacity for offshore wind targets is a couple hundred gigawatts within 2030 and 2050. So there was a very, very large expansion of offshore wind within this area. And this is, again, kind of seeing renewables becoming a centerpiece of European energy and industrial security. So the industrial aspect becomes really important here because Europe has a very, very dominant position within offshore wind. And within these areas, it's very economically competitive, especially within these industrial zones. I mean, mainly Benelux area, northwestern France, and most of the German area within, of course, the North Sea. But this is starting to reach constraints because of fiscal conservatism. You can see the German debt brake limits federal spending. There was a derogation of this due to COVID. However, there was a federal court ruling that said that the extension of this is not legally, there's no legal ground for this. So this was just a few months ago, and the big crunch from this was that Scholz announced they would cut 45 billion euros from climate spending. Most of that is not purely climate spending. A lot of it's mitigation spending, so energy efficiency, heat pumps, and a bunch of other things that would dramatically reduce Germany's energy import dependency. So it is climate per se, but it's also energy and security as well, because they eventually become one and the same, especially when you're talking about direct reduction on energy imports. And there's the other caveat of this is that the German energy imports for LNG have largely come from the United States, and there was a very recent announcement for political reasons or otherwise to kind of limit exports or to pausing permits or any. This is just the rhetoric, at least. And at the moment, I believe Germany was importing about 86% of its LNG or 80-something% of its LNG from the United States as of last year, which is, again, a significant importance. But the German public opinion on the debt brake is interesting because there's a discussion about whether or not to suspend it, whether or not to abolish it, and largely there was a study done by the IFO Institute that shows that most people don't really want to abolish it, but they're very, very in favor of suspending it, especially if that advances climate mitigation, which is, again, energy, and they're one and the same. and showing where spending cuts and spending savings should occur to allow for this spending to continue. Climate was one of the, it was the third highest, but again, social welfare and subsidies were substantially higher. So there is still some sentiment to cut from climate mitigation, but it's a very, very marginal one at best. But how this evolves towards the transatlantic energy security, you can see that the public opinion and political opinion are different. The public is kind of recognizing that especially within the German context, that climate is very, very important, and it ties directly into energy security, especially the price that they're paying directly for the cost of energy itself. And they want the German government to kind of move away from this fiscal conservatism that they've historically held to, especially in terms of reaching their climate targets and improving their energy security at the same time. So to answer the first question, what lessons should Europe learn from Ukraine towards a lasting energy security situation? I think in this case, you can actually see more realistic representation of the social position and where the general public actually sit on this debate, because the German people are extremely pro-climate, and they really, really are active in this discussion. And I think that the political dynamics don't always represent that. And there are sometimes marginal groups that can actually capitalize and lock in that conversation. And within Germany, the conversation between climate security and energy security kind of oscillates back and forth. But there is an increasing recognition that climate security and energy security are becoming quite intertwined, and that investing in renewables and energy efficiency really dramatically improves German energy security, but also European energy security more broadly. And an energy secure Europe has direct transatlantic implications, because a more secure Europe is more secure European transatlantic community in itself, especially in the context of industrial energy prices and all of these things. But beyond that, I also think it's really imperative to see the kind of strategies you can see in this place, because Germany oscillated from complete input for security and strategic implications, and now it has a strategy and all of these strategic footprints, but how those are operationalized and whether there's political momentum to actually push those over the line and deliver on the strategies actually outlined. That's kind of where there's uncertainty. And you can see this with the emphasis on de-risking and the China strategy itself. It also mentions that Germany will implement this entire strategy without really spending an additional euro, which it's not entirely credible that you're going to de-risk from China without spending an additional euro, right? So there is some risk, there is some issues in this space, and the dependence on China only is magnified when you have discussions with the Inflation Reduction Act and the Net Zero Industrial Act, and how you actually deploy these strategies and secure green industries to compete with Chinese electric vehicles, solar panels, and all of the things without actually spending additional money or reallocating money from one pot to another. So it's very, very uncertain what that looks like. But I definitely very, very looking forward to, I think I'm running out of time here. I'm very looking forward to hear my counterparts' positions on how we can effectively combine decarbonization and energy security, because Germany looks like they're trying to do it and had an effective plan to do it, but they are not willing to spend the money that even that they would be otherwise able to do so. Thank you.
I think this takeaway message has been heard now, and I will move quite slightly actually to you, Nicolas, maybe to hear a little bit your perspective, because of course, I mean, from a French perspective, I mean, France has been affected in different way actually, because we have also different states. So I give you the floor now if you want.
Well, many thanks, Annabelle, and so many thanks to the DFRS and the US Embassy in Paris for inviting me. And of course, my presentation or the discussion doesn't commit the French Navy, as I'm expressing myself as an energy specialist. Well, as Loyle mentioned, there is this point, about not spending to the next euro in terms of securing our energy transition, because as you all know, energy security is a matter of geopolitical issue, as well as a matter of economic sustainability. And the intertwined situation between these geopolitical issues and economic sustainability of the energy transition, of the energy security, is nowadays the core issue of rethinking or transforming the transatlantic relationship towards better energy security issues. It's very interesting because when discussing about transatlantic security is mostly NATO. And when you're looking at the way NATO is dealing with energy, it's a recent topic. It's roughly 10 years ago that NATO endorsed energy security as a core topic. And when you're looking at the final acts of every NATO summit since the World Summit in 2014, the issue of energy security is ever growing in importance within NATO. So in my perspective and in the French perspective, I think that discussing about energy security in a transatlantic perspective is a matter, first of all, for NATO-EU cooperation. And when we're discussing of reinforcing this NATO-EU cooperation, energy, among other topics, or let's call them dual-use topics or civilian military topics such as cyber, such as influence or disinformation, but energy could be at the core of this reinforced transatlantic security issue. As you mentioned, Annabelle, France is having a different energy mix, so a different perspective than Germany, yet the conclusions are the same. We need to continue the path we're engaged in for years now within the energy transition, decarbonization, reinforcing the role of renewables, strengthening the role in Europe, and not only in Europe, also in the whole transatlantic area of nuclear, which is within the European Union and among European partners, a very important topic for debate, because not all European countries are aligned with this issue of reinforcing or redeveloping nuclear technologies or nuclear industrial base. Yet, when I'm looking at this issue of transatlantic security and transatlantic energy security from a quasi-military perspective, because we're dealing about security issues, it's, let's say, it's creating two different areas of issues. First of all, we're discussing about the energy supplies. And of course, depending or not really depending on what will happen in Ukraine, the Russian forces that will be at the end of the war, the less affected by the war will be the Russian Navy, and especially the submarine forces. And their area of action may be the Atlantic Ocean. And tomorrow, a way for Russia to disrupt the coherence of the transatlantic relationship, maybe, we don't know, but maybe within the North Atlantic area and looking at this potentially energy security issues. So first of all, this area of the Atlantic that in the strategic thinking have for now a little bit more than 10 years being considered as secondary when looking at other areas such as the Indo-Pacific, is more and more becoming again a central area of strategic issues, looking at this new energy security issue, the strengthening of the transatlantic link regarding LNG, regarding petroleum products, regarding the link between North American and European countries. Secondly, this issue of transatlantic cooperation for energy security is not only centered on the North Atlantic area. Look at what's happening nowadays in the Red Sea, or the Horn of Africa, or the need for transatlantic partners, NATO partners, but not only NATO partners, NATO, EU, European countries, North Atlantic countries, to cooperate and to deal with issues that are affecting energy supplies for Europe, but also energy supplies potentially for the North Atlantic area. So this issue of transatlantic energy security is not only in the Atlantic, it could be all over the world. And that's one of the key insights of globalization of energy supplies, is that things are not only happening within a single region of the world, but are happening all over the world. So we have to be prepared to cooperate, not only for strengthening the direct link, so the link in the Atlantic, but also to cooperate for strengthening the link of maintaining the rule of international order, maintaining the freedom of navigation, especially for energy, as with the decontinentalization of European energy supplies, where more and more relying on, first of all, of course, the North Atlantic area and the United States, Canada, for example, but also from Arab Persian Gulf countries, African countries, India, for example, for petroleum product. So this issue of cooperation is a global issue of cooperation in energy security. And I think it's a key element that we have to be aware of, is that I think one of our major mistakes for Europeans was to think that energy security was only a regional issue, was an issue in Europe or Eurasia, first of all, and that it could only be decided or regulated by the laws of the market. And what happened in 2022 showed us that energy security, of course, is a matter of economic sustainability. I started with this point in my presentation, but is also a matter of geopolitics. It's also a matter of security, like the essential meaning of this word, and of military, diplomatic, strategic cooperation. So, of course, I'm enlarging the topic and explaining that this transatlantic energy security is not only a transatlantic issue, yet I think that it's important to think that it's a multilateral cooperation issue, first of all, multidimensional also cooperation issue, because as Loyle mentioned, there are topics within, and Annabelle also you mentioned, are topics in renewables, in energy efficiency, in potentially nuclear, in electric networks and globally networks, not only in electricity, in energy storage, that are all areas of cooperation possible for the transatlantic relationship. But in the same time, there are also areas of competition between US, Canadian, European companies. That's an issue to deal with. It's a co-competition issue, of course. And we have China, which is the most advanced country at the moment on future electric networks technologies, on energy storage technologies, batteries, but also including tomorrow, potentially hydrogen. China that's avancing very fast in fourth generation nuclear power plants. So it's also an issue to deal with. And the articulation between purely security or purely geopolitical issues and economic sustainability for North American countries as well as for European countries will be the trickiest, balance to achieve, including also, which is the latest layer on the cake, this, of course, very important issue of climate change. So I'm not giving you any answers. I'm just opening you more questions, but please do not be angry at me for doing so.
No, that's actually great. I mean, I am pretty sure it will helps also for the discussion. It's also good to hear as well so many possibilities are actually to cooperate. So maybe now I will turn to you, Jane, maybe to hear a little bit, from the other side, let's say, of the ocean, to see actually how was the whole geopolitical context, how it has been perceived actually from the US perspective, because of course Europe's been also affected. So maybe you can just detail a little bit more about it.
Thank you so much, Annabelle, and thank you so much to the US Embassy in Paris as well as FRS for the invitation. So I wanted to share with you 3 key ways that I think that the Russia's war of aggression has affected the way the sort of energy policy environment in the United States and also energy sector, if you will. But then also I wanted to touch upon how the notion or the concept of energy security in the US policymaking has evolved because of that. So the first way that I think this war has affected the US is that I think there was this clear realization that our natural gas resource in the form of LNG is something that has strategic value that can help our allies in Europe not only avert the worst sort of energy crisis, the worst case, but then also to pursue the EU's desire and goal to reduce dependence on Russia. And out of the US-EU task force on energy security the objectives included, EU gas supply diversification. And out of that, in March 2022, the Biden White House and European Commission agreed to expand the bilateral gas trade to 50 BCM of US LNG supply annually to 2030. I think Loyle did a great job sort of showing us sort of a scale, it's how much 50 BCM means. That was much more of a German context, but it gives us the sort of the volume, the scale of this commitment. And I think thanks to the continued production of competitively priced natural gas within the United States, the US LNG exports to Europe reached 56 BCM in 2022. And that was 2 years ago. And last year, it reached 63 BCM. And I think today the US accounts for roughly half of Europe's LNG imports. That's quite remarkable. So that's one effect. The second one is that the US has witnessed this EU dependence on Russian oil gas and how that created this strategic vulnerabilities that could be a possible sort of analog to the US dependence on sort of single suppliers for some of the commodities that are key to the energy security. Specifically, as Nicolas has already sort of mentioned, China has been cultivating its resources and R&D capacity, and China is really the leading country on many of the clean energy technology components, and also importantly, the underlying critical minerals, right? Not just rare earth, but many of the minerals. So that type of dependence has been a concern to US policymakers since before the Russian invasion of Ukraine. But I think watching our European allies and friends be so exposed to the Russian the vulnerabilities and the Russian leverage over fossil fuels really has was the additional wake up, well, I guess not a wake up call, but additional really alarming situation. And that really furthered the US government effort to secure its supply chains for these clean energy components. So, as a consequence, we've seen several major legislation, sort of the green industrial strategy pieces, if you will, including Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act that passed Congress in November of 2021 that appropriated $75.8 billion for various energy-related programs that included roughly $8 billion for clean energy technology supply chains. That included like processing, manufacturing, and recycling of battery materials. And then, more recently, the Inflation Reduction Act that passed Congress in August of 2022, that included provisions like advanced manufacturing production tax credit that really seeks to incentivize the domestic production of solar, wind, and battery components, and also necessary critical minerals. And also the Clean Vehicle Consumer Tax Credit, which of course ended up creating tension, unfortunately, with some of our allies and partners. But I think later on, I think the administration has been trying to figure out the way to friendshore and perhaps make it a little more expansive, trying to really secure the global supply chains for these minerals, but then also battery components. And quickly, the third area of effect from the war, to me, is that the United States was also reminded of our own dependence on Russia, namely really the nuclear fuel. Roughly, the U.S. relies on Russia for 28% of our enriched uranium that are used at nuclear power plants within the United States. But as a consequence, the fiscal year 2024 National Defense Authorization Act provided money to support domestic capability to produce not just the low enriched uranium for existing power plants, but then also high assay low enriched uranium that are needed for the advanced reactors reactors that are now on the current light water reactor model, the designs. And that's basically where, Russia is about the only country with commercial production capacity. So, and just quickly also, Russia does produce, class 1 nickel. That's really important for lithium ion batteries that many of the countries, including the US and many of the European partners, rely on. And just quickly, and how these sort of effects then impacted the way the notion or the concept of energy security is, viewed in Washington at the moment. One, I think, I agree with, I think, my co-panelists. I think the climate, it's in many ways, it's really the decarbonization and energy security are closely linked. And I think, to me, it's the dual challenge. And clean energy technologies really help address both energy security and decarbonization, but also it does come with well, let me just wrap up that push. So it's no longer either or, right? So that's one. The second way the notion of energy security has evolved is, I think, it's still largely defined as sort of access to affordable, uninterrupted supply of energy and largely oil and gas. Let's face it, we still rely on oil and gas. But I think the scope for this access is expanding to include components for these clean energy technologies and underlying critical minerals. And that's really expanding quite quickly. And that's a very important sort of aspect of it, this evolution. And let me just quickly say, and I do want to, I'm happy to talk more about the sort of a transatlantic cooperation part. But I think the US is now also trying to, see itself as partners in much more of energy security partners to Europe, and certainly under this administration. And through things like the Mineral Security Partnership that was launched at the G7 in Germany 2 years ago. Both obviously French and German governments are key partners. We're looking at ways to really diversify the global supply chains of these minerals that are important for energy transition. But then also US-EU partnership or support for the Lobedo Corridor project in Africa. And it's also out of the it was announced at the G20 in India, but like using these multilateral forums, I think US wants to really be one of the leading countries. And then also quickly the lower carbon fuels like hydrogen and ammonia. I think there are so many companies and projects within the United States that are looking to work more closely. And for better or worse, within the United States, the prospect for demand is probably much weaker, maybe because we do not have carbon pricing. But I think personally, I think that US could be doing has a lot to gain by having overseas off-takers to help this healthy supply of clean hydrogen from the United States. And then of course LNG, Loyle, I think you mentioned that. And I think that's really an interesting one. I think the US policymakers are sort of grappling with what it means for the United States to be this #1 LNG supplier in the world at the moment. Of course, there are a lot of good things, but then of course we need to really look at emissions profile and also the economic competitiveness angle, also the effects on the domestic economy. And it's an area that's I think fast evolving. And just quickly, 10 seconds. To me, I think the evaluation, of the what to do with LNG export now that the capacity is so much bigger, at least double the size from the time that we started exporting in 2016. I think it's warranted. It makes sense, but we shouldn't conflate the pause. And I think when you say political, and I'm not putting words into your mouth, but I think the pause may have some political background, or certainly sort of backdrop. But I think the review itself is something that was probably timely. So I think when we look at this, and so, you know, basically the review could have happened without the pause, right? But anyway, so I think, you know, as we look at this dynamics, it's also important to look at what's the underlining sort of more of a policy issue versus political dynamics. But thanks so much. Let me stop here.
Many thanks, Jean, for this. So actually, a lot of things with this first round, let's say. So it's but what I mean, sort of takeaway from my side is at least we can say there is a global consensus about the fact actually that you have this nexus actually of security and climate issues that are actually combined and understood this way actually in every part actually of the Atlantic. So it is the first thing, and also basically to be more focused on the whole energy chain, let's say from critical materials, but also, you know, with the whole supply chain into the, and not only it's not only about energy supply itself as a final product. So this leads maybe to some questions, firstly also from my side, and I also invite, of course, the audience to join me with this in this dynamic, and which would be actually, so Nicolas, you mentioned it a little bit, but it's about how we can actually organize it, because basically we see that there are a huge scope actually of possibilities of cooperations and so on, but then it's a little bit the question, as Loyle also mentioned in his presentation, of the problem of costs as well, and how you can prioritize actually where the efforts must be led actually in priority. So I would be glad actually to hear if you have some input on that firstly, and also it's a little bit more largely, it's something we can hear sometimes. It's a little bit, you know, we are under the impression that sometimes it's about, you know, the position between, for instance, the US and also the others, EU member states and so on. It's about, let's say, a little bit cooperation, somehow coordination, but also competition. And the question is a little bit how we can articulate it, especially when we are actually talking constantly about Russian threat, and also trying to get more independency actually from China as well. So I would be glad to hear of you. I'm sorry if it's you know, like sort of broad questions, but maybe, I don't know if Nicolas, you would like to start. I guess I saw you reacting a little bit.
Many thanks for this question. Of course, very broad. Well, to discuss on what to focus on. I think we need, first of all, to be aware of our vulnerabilities, first of all, and secondly, of our strength. The Euro-Atlantic area is the most advanced area in the world in terms of innovation, in terms of technological development, in terms of superior education. So our ability in Europe and the US, for example, to produce top world-class engineers, for example, as no equivalent in the world. So this is one of our strengths, this ability to generate innovation, to generate new companies, to, of course, it's also linked with democracy. When you're in a democratic area, it's easier in a liberal democratic environment to help people to create, to innovate, to generate new projects. So it's one of our abilities, it's one of our strengths. Secondly, of course, as I mentioned, we need also to focus on our weaknesses and to look on how to solve it. For example, when we're discussing about value chains, and the strategic value chain at the time, as Jen mentioned, also Loyle, is the LNG value chain between the US and Europe. And when you're looking at the LNG value chain, of course, the most important part of the value chain is the transportation. And within this LNG value chain, the most important part, the most crucial, is not energy related. It's industry related. It's the ability to build methane carriers. It's not a matter of energy, it's a matter of industry, it's a matter of naval construction, the ability of building a certain number of ships in a dedicated time in order to be certain that there is no bottleneck in the transportation of gas from one shore to the other of the Atlantic. And the problem, for example, when looking at this topic nowadays, is that more than 90% of the specialized construction of methane carriers is located in Northeast Asia, China, South Korea, Japan, 90%. So it's meaning that in terms of energy security, the transatlantic area, and as Jane mentioned, the United States became the world's first exporter of LNG. We're having there a very important weakness. So we need to focus on the cooperation in order to redevelop the ability to build at a sufficient level this kind of specialized vessels in order to transport methane, in order to transport energy. So I think that first of all, we need to be aware, as I mentioned, vulnerabilities and competitive and comparative advantages. Then, of course, Annabelle, as you discussed, there is this matter of competition, coordination, and cooperation. But, well, it has been also very well explained in the literature and the economic literature about the theory of competition. We're within the theory of competition nowadays. And of course, it's the same since the end of the Second World War. We worked in a transatlantic way to develop, for example, nuclear civilian technologies. Of course, there was also, following this era of cooperation to develop the technology, the competition between the companies, but also in a democratic and liberal world, competition is a good thing. So we don't need to be afraid, excuse me, of competition between companies. The idea is to work all together to develop the technologies. The way the technologies will be implemented by the companies, it's a matter of competition. So it's, again, perfectly normal that there is also an area for competition, and we don't need to be afraid of this issue. If we are afraid about what will happen with competition between the companies that will develop technological solutions and technological products, of course, we will not cooperate. Let's cooperate, and then let's do as we were doing all the time. Let's the market and let the company compete between them and see what's the best product. I think it's also an issue with this liberal orientation and the democratic orientation. The idea is not nowadays to switch to some kind of a planned economy. European countries or the US are not China, are not Russia. So we have to stick also to our core values, including in the economic area.
Many thanks for this. Maybe Loyle, you would like to add something on it? I don't know if you're... Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much for the floor, Annabelle, and thank you as well, Nicolas and Jane, for your remarks and presentations. They're very insightful. I completely agree with Nicolas that one of the advantages of a liberal market economy is the efficient allocation of capital to the best technologies. But I think that the important thing is to recognize that not all actors are good faith actors, and intellectual property right infringement and things like this, and industrial policy and corporate espionage and this stuff is definitely tools that have been used in the past. And I think that in this point, it's a matter of trying to balance stricter controls on technological cooperation and industrial cooperation, and trying to find areas where you can cooperate with China while imposing your rules. And this is why for me personally, I advocate for German companies to cooperate with Chinese companies outside of China, or maybe even in the case where you're cooperating within the European Union, where European battery passport regulations and ESG regulations can be fairly enforced. And in this case, you have a lot more flexibility, because the problem is if you're investing in for production directly within China, you're subject to the CCP's direct political whim, which could change from one day to the next. And in this case, your industrial technology and your IPR and your essentially your cutting edges can gradually be siphoned away, which is one of the things that has really been happening over the past few decades. And there's a difference between China winning and being more competitive and innovative. And in that case, I think then fine, they deserve to have technological leadership because they've outcompeted. But there's a huge difference between that and stuff being, forcefully taken away from companies who just want to make business in China. So I think that having a more fair and reasonable and realistic conversation of what cooperation and what competition is, as Nicolas mentioned, I think that this is kind of where the ball is moving, and I think that it's fair to have this conversation evolving. But I do also want to emphasize another major, not and sometimes weakness, but also sometimes a benefit of democracies is the political cycle. You have the agenda points and elections. So I appreciate Jane mentioning the political nature of the pauses, because I mean, the pauses aren't retroactive. They don't exactly cancel existing permits. So you have a huge amount of backlog of LNG export capacity that's definitely still coming online. And I think it's a matter of, when you're assessing them, looking at it from an objective point of view, where you're saying, what's the political timeline of this? Because I mean, President Biden does this at a pen stroke. He can undo it at a pen stroke. I mean, it's not a matter of canceling LNG exports overnight. It's a matter of even scoring some political victory points that for the next 4 years could guarantee that there's a Democrat within the White House, whether that be Biden or otherwise. I mean, that's a different conversation. In that case, you're actually securing long-term investment and support for renewable energies or green industry to be deployed, or the IRA to see more fulfillment development, right? Rather than having the alternative. So I think in this case, it's about actually having, I mean, especially as analysts, there's a difference between broad public reaction and placating to social groups that want their celebration and want their headlines to be very, very dynamic and celebratory for, to achieve electoral support. But as an analyst, you can look at the whole situation and say, okay, well, in this immediate pause doesn't really do much. It just kind of slows things down that won't even have an impact for at least another 5 or 6 years, while all the permitted plants are still being brought online. And in that case, European LNG or European gas demand is supposed to decline anyways, at least in terms of respect to the decarbonization target. So, I mean, is there really a really big deal if the American LNG exports have a cap on them that they're nowhere even near? Not inherently, but it's a matter about looking at how the political and social dynamics and decisions also kind of play into it, because you want to make sure that energy transition maintains that social support on both sides of the Atlantic, so that you don't have too much energy nationalism and an energy isolationism occurring in the United States, where they want to keep all the gas at home, but or a kind of eco-driven energy. I don't know. I don't have the final word for that, but where you have Europeans pushing too far towards the climate, because in this case, you can either have sometimes American LNG that has a higher methane footprint to heat your homes, or you could have nothing. And it's not that I'm a very proactive supporter of the decarbonization targets, but sometimes you can't have all of the options, or you can't have all of your favorites. You have to pick and choose, and this is definitely a period where that's occurring. So, but I believe that's all of the points that I have. But I really appreciated the point on the methane shippers. I didn't realize that was the case, and I think that's a very, very important bottleneck to highlight.
Thank you, Loyle. And maybe Jane, would you like to add also something on it?
Yes, yeah, if I may. I mean, I think my co-panelists have already articulated really well. But just one thing to add is that I agree that U.S. and Europe are not China or Russia, and it's not like we want to be one. But at the same time, when we look at the volume and the scale of the state financing that's coming into these markets, how to unlock the private sector, financing into more clean energy supply chains, but then also some of these markets for critical minerals has been a huge challenge. It's a continued challenge. There are at least 50 different minerals on the U.S. list, and I think EU also has its list, roughly 3 dozen. And each has its own different sort of vulnerabilities, and how to compete with the sort of state-led investments into developing countries, resource-rich countries and continents is really a big issue. And one area where I love to see a little more cooperation perhaps is precisely to use more market regulation experience and expertise that we have, both in Europe and in the US, the commodity trading, all these, regulations and enforcement. If they're more sort of a coordination as to, how to detect, some sort of manipulations. I'm not an economist, I'm not a market, I'm not a regulator, But I think because we can, yes, we should keep reaching out to these economies and then try to, include them in our sort of a growing clean energy, sort of a value chain. But if we don't then address the potential market manipulation, half of it, then we will always be playing this catch up. The gap may not really close as much. So that's where I think, US and EU colleagues have much more of a collaboration that we could be thinking of in the context of clean energy and energy security. Thanks.
Many things. That's very interesting because when we hear you, actually, it's more or less about also to have a rule of order. I mean, in a word with different rules that must be respected actually by everyone, and it's maybe actually one of the main aspects or broader aspects of cooperation we all might have actually through different tools and so on. So it's maybe we can come back actually to this point in a minute. It's just because I would like to shift a little bit maybe once more to you, Nicolas, because I think this question in the chat, I don't know if you already read it, would be quite targeted to you. Maybe you could have also, because you mentioned as well the NATO as possibility, of existing structure actually for more to deepen actually transatlantic cooperation in the field of energy security, and maybe you would like also to answer this question to you.
Yes, of course, the question about the armed forces in the framework of energy. Yes, the idea is that for the moment, or not really for the moment, we have to be aware that the major driver for armed forces regarding energy is the operational efficiency. So it's the energy density, to be clear. Or then for the moment, we don't have materials as dense in terms of energy as fossil fuels, as petroleum products. So for the moment, it's not possible to shift away from petroleum products, from the single fuel policy. So in NATO, we're having a single fuel called F34, which is jet fuel A1, roughly, which is the core of the single fuel policy of NATO, because operational efficiency for the armed forces is the core of energy and the core of any engagement of the armed forces. Yet, it's not meaning that we're not discussing, we're not working, we're not investing in other technologies. For example, one of the technologies that is the most invested by the armed forces are biofuels. And all the armed forces all over the transatlantic area, namely the US, Canada, European Union countries, Norway, etc., are investing in biofuels, because biofuels are helping us to lower the level of dependency regarding imported fossil fuels from Arab Persian Gulf countries, from Russia historically, etc., while maintaining this energy density or not lowering the energy density of the fuels at a level that could hamper the operational efficiency of the armed forces. Electrification is also a matter that is explored by the armed forces, yet electrification is not possible for all the operational constraints. For example, you cannot have for the moment electric planes. You may have electric drones, but electric jet aircraft is not possible. The same for hydrogen. Hydrogen is also having technological constraints. For example, it's highly explosive. Liquid is highly corrosive. So it's also creating other issues. Petroleum products are easy to store, easy to transform, easy to transport, and easy to use. And as long as we are not able to find something that is the same level of ease of transportation, use, and safety also, because it's a very safe fuel, the fuel you're using in the military, it's not possible to shift away from fossil fuels. And as for any other, I think, energy system, the answer, from my perspective, will not be to shift from the F34 in NATO towards another fuel, sustainable or hydrogen or any other, but to have a more what's going to say, diversified mix. So not relying only on fossil fuel, but relying mostly on fossil fuel, and for some applications that are not having this imperative of operational efficiency to enhance electrification, to enhance the use of renewable energy sources, to develop in some part very specialized the use of hydrogen, to create or to invest in robust batteries, etc., etc. We will not be able to shift away from these fossil fuels in the years to come. Yet, by investing, by testing, by cooperating, and that's the role, for example, the NATO Center of Excellence on Energy Security, the NSEC-COE of Vilnius, will be, and also the works of the European Defense Agency on this topic, will be able to have this diversification in the armed forces. So the armed forces are following exactly the same path at the rest of the societies in the transatlantic area, diversification as an answer for energy security.
Many thanks, Nicolas, for this clarification. And maybe, because I know you will leave actually in a couple of minutes, maybe just a last word and on it as well, because you mentioned, you know, the cooperation between the NATO and the EU, and would it be actually because the NATO is still only focused actually on military forces, how can you see actually the link, or how would it be actually a good way to cooperate between each other, because it's already existing in some ways, but actually how we could deepen it? So maybe some words on it. And yes.
Well, when you're looking at NATO, historically speaking, NATO developed, for example, infrastructures in Europe. So the NATO pipeline system, it's a military infrastructure, because the first goal of this infrastructure was to provide fuel to the NATO forces that were deployed in Western Germany in case of invasion from the Warsaw Pact. But nowadays, this infrastructure is also used by the civilian actors in France, in Italy, in Germany, etc., to transport petroleum products. So, of course, NATO is focusing on military operation. NATO is focusing on strengthening and enhancing the defense sector. But all the investments, all the technologies that are being developed may also be used by the civilian sector. And nowadays, we're not in the same path we were during the 50s or the 60s, when the defense spending were creating the path for the civilian technologies, and then the civilian companies and civilian technologies benefited from the military investment. Nowadays, it's being more complex, and military also can benefit from civilian investment, civilian innovation, in order to have this translation into military equipment. So we need to develop within the defense, within NATO, within the EU, and within the cooperation framework between NATO and the EU, this way to benefit from military and civilian cross investments, cross developments, in order to advance in these technologies. For example, the nuclear reactors that are nowadays producing electricity for the US population, the French population, the Canadian population, were firstly developed for nuclear powered submarines. So it's also meaning that there is a natural path of dual use for energy technology, and we need to re-strengthen this idea that energy technologies are by nature of dual use. They are not military by nature, they are not civilian by nature, but they can benefit both. And it's a way for, as it is happening for at the moment in the United States, for interagency investment, interagency coordination in developing the technologies. When you're looking at what's happening in the nuclear civilian sector in the United States, it's this example of interagency financing, this interagency coordination, including the defense, for developing this new technology, and the results are very spectacular. So I think it's an important lesson for all the countries and all the actors on the transatlantic area. We need to strengthen at national level, at regional level, and at the transatlantic level, this coordination, interagency, and multilateral, because there is no energy that is military or civilian by nature.
I think that's a very huge takeaway also to have in mind. So many thanks, Nicolas. And if I don't have the time to do so, many thanks once more that you be here. And it's always a pleasure. So maybe I will not turn to you also, Jane, because, you know, this sort of cooperations and so on, maybe it could be also interesting to see from more a US perspectives, actually. Would it be make sense, or would it be perceived actually as also a way to leverage and also to come up actually with the different stakes we mentioned before? So maybe just to hear you a little bit about on this topic.
Sure, thank you. I think actually, just you know, following up on this nuclear. I mean, nuclear has received, in my view, just unexpected level of attention at the recent COP28, both fusion and fission. But the goal to triple the existing capacity by 2050 is an extremely ambitious goal. And certainly without countries that are fast developing or deploying, power generation nuclear like China, right? So that pledge does not include those countries, but many of the countries that really want to address, I think, this dual challenge. And it's going to be interesting to see to what extent how the energy dynamics, particularly in, I think, Europe may continue, especially I think in Eastern and Central, Europe, sort of in favor of nuclear, and in part as sort of a shift away from Russia, but then also shift away from oil and gas, fossil fuels. And also the State Department has been quite active in supporting countries that are trying to shift away from coal to nuclear, as opposed to coal to gas, under its Project Phoenix, if I'm not mistaken. There's so many different exciting projects that are currently out of State Department. But so it's in many ways, nuclear, I think, is really about to have sort of a renewed, hopefully, renaissance. And both small modular and advanced reactors, and also micro reactors, they're all having quite a bit of a attracting interest, not just from power utilities, but also from industrial users, like chemical companies that are trying to that do have their own sustainability and their own company decarbonization target, and in order to have secure and low carbon electricity and energy sources to keep stay competitive, they're looking at nuclear more closely than before. So it's very interesting. Also, I wanted to come back a little bit to hydrogen and ammonia, and I very much appreciate Nicolas' comment about this sort of a midstream expertise. That's something a lot of Western companies have. But at the same time, some of the shipbuilding itself has really shifted to Northeast Asia. And it'd be really interesting to see how the midstream for hydrogen and ammonia and other hydrogen vectors may evolve, because right at the moment, many of the companies that have LNG expertise to liquefy natural gas are also investing in technologies to liquefy hydrogen, and how that competition may evolve. But I think that may be also an area where European and US companies could have more synergy, alongside healthy competition. The other thing I wanted to also mention is a little bit going back to the innovation piece. I fully agree. I think a lot of European and US universities are still producing a lot of bright minds. But when we look at some of the patent filings, international patent filings for technologies, clean energy technologies, we are definitely starting to see other countries and areas, fast growing, and that's not a bad thing. More competition is good. As so long as there's a level, the fair, field. But I think at least when we look at things like hydrogen patent filings, I noticed Europe is actually doing, it seems to be doing really well. And then of course, China is also busy, doing both innovation side and also manufacturing side. The US is starting to lag. So I'm hoping that's also an area where some of the national labs, despite, the, of course, natural area for competition. And again, competition is really important to really get, to sort of have race to the top. But at the same time, to the extent that we can really have open competitive supply chains down the road, I think some level of cooperation in many of the innovation in these clean energy technology areas could be, I think warrants more attention. So let me stop there. Thanks.
Many thanks, Jane. And I guess, bye, Nicolas. See you soon then. And so maybe when we are talking actually about hydrogen, it's quite difficult actually to go away from Germany, of course. So therefore, Loyle, I'm turning to you actually. Would you think actually it is maybe already a sort of maybe a wish from Germany to cooperate more with the US on this field, or maybe it is already existing? So what are your insight on it? And yes, maybe to start already with it.
Yeah, German hydrogen position is a big one. But first, because I'm representing a German input, I do think it's important to say that nuclear renaissance is occurring in many countries, but there are definitely certain countries and ecosystems where a nuclear renaissance is less than politically and socially desirable. I will leave it summarized at that, because I don't want the mobs to come after me. But German hydrogen position is quite interesting. So Germany is most countries like France, for example, or the United States, really pursued this notion of energy sovereignty and energy independence, really to be like self-sufficient in energy. There's a lot of countries that broadly pursued this and across one period or another. Germany, for a long period of time, has accepted that it's an energy importer. So it's essentially like German political and social thought is essentially at the point where we have massive amounts of industrial output, globalized companies that can ship and make goods and sell them abroad. We accept, however, that we are essentially dependent on and reliant on energy imports. France does not. France has a very large amount of energy independence, and most other countries do. Germany is one of the very few countries that just goes globally trying to import as much energy as possible. So the German hydrogen policy is across the Atlantic, both to Canada and the United States, is looking to import hydrogen. This is one thing, but transatlantic space is just a narrow margin of this. Germany has gone to many other places in the Pacific, across Africa, Southeast Asia, and otherwise, and Latin America to try and create a global market of hydrogen. The reason why I'm going global on this context is because, as Nicolas mentioned, energy security is not a regional issue, especially in the context of hydrogen, because Germany, the German political establishment essentially functions and relies on global governance and global rules-based system to really function. That, like, the German economy is structured on that. So for them, they're really positioning to try and make a global market for hydrogen, and what that looked like by standards and certificates and all of this stuff. This is the general conversation that they're pushing. And H2 Global and all of the other European initiatives, there's a whole pile of them. Large amount of them are substantively led by Germany, because Germany wants to create a global hydrogen market where different producers can compete on price and eventually, create essentially what has become the LNG market. Because, I mean, if you look 10, 15 years ago, there was not necessarily a global LNG market. The global LNG market is a very, very recent occurrence because there has been a lot of LNG providers coming online, largely the US, but other countries like Australia, Qatar, and several others, but specifically the US swing capacity is something that really brings and changes the situation, because it becomes a net gas and oil exporter. But in the case of hydrogen in transatlantic space, it's a bit more complicated, and I think this will also depend on what kind of hydrogen is coming out of the US, whether it be blue, green, ideally for the German case, or and what kind of green is going into it, whether that be hydrogen or hydropower, solar and or wind. But it's a very, very complex dynamic. But I think to I think the conversation sometimes is a bit idealized, where they expect that where industrials expect that a large amount of hydrogen can come online just tomorrow or within a few short years. And I think it's important to recognize that hydrogen will become a really, really crucial part of the decarbonization path, especially for industry, because there are certain applications that cannot be electrified. And this goes back to Nicolas's point that there are different interpretations and conceptions of energy security depending on which sector you're looking at. If you look at the military sector, biofuels is like one of the most important things because you need optimized performance when you're dealing with a foe that is dealing to optimize performance and doesn't really care about decarbonization, for example, right? You can't trade off performance and capacity to just decarbonize if it threatens the risk of losing or having lower operational capacity, right? That's just kind of a given. But it gets interesting when we start looking at the power sector and industry, because renewables and hydrogen have a very, very, very very big role to play, especially when moving away from oil and gas. But I don't know if I answered your question entirely, because I'm trying to summarize the German hydrogen position, and it's a very, very, very large. But yeah, I think going back to the globalized market is really, really kind of at least at the center of it, where it goes. But I don't think it'll materialize within the next few years. But I definitely think from 2030 onwards, it will definitely become a global thing. But for the next few years, I think that there's better ways to use those green electrons than creating hydrogen, because you lose a lot of efficiency in that.
Oh, perfect. I mean, many thanks, Loyle, for this clarification as well. And maybe if you agree with it, I would like just to finish, maybe to use the last minutes, maybe to talk about a point actually that Nicolas mentioned as well about the dual use, and the conception of having energy technologies that might be used actually for civilian and military purposes, because it's actually a dynamic we can already observe is that actually both branch sectors are more and more linked, especially when it's about energy. And therefore, my question would be maybe slightly different depending on you both. Jane, maybe is it probably something that does already exist in the US, or how is it seen? Is there any incentive actually in this sense? And for Loyle, maybe what would be the social acceptance actually of it? Or is it also something that might be seen or feasible, let's say in Germany, regarding the current context and maybe the side menu? So maybe Jane, you would like to start? Yeah.
Sure. So I'm sorry, just to make sure. So your question is if there is incentives in the US to help
yes, or
use?
Exactly, incentive or at least interest in it. If would it be an issue, or would it be maybe something that might be interesting actually to do so, to work on?
And is it within the US or with the EU, like bilaterally, or the collaboration? Just the US is okay? Okay.
Maybe both. Yeah.
Okay, sounds good. Yeah, thank you. So quickly, I think in the US there's I think it's for example, nuclear, as Nicolas said, was is dual use by nature, and despite the US nuclear industry having sort of a period of a slowdown right at the moment, the submarine side and also aircraft carriers, they all benefit from nuclear reactors that are being produced, and I think generally within the US there isn't perhaps the type of adverse reaction to the notion of dual use that some other societies may have. And even things like high capacity battery technology, many of them, we focus in the context of EV batteries, but of course, some of these high capacity batteries also benefit military operations. And it's no coincidence that when the President Biden instructed the in-depth study of supply chains his first year in the office, there was so-called 100-day report on 4 different sectors. One of them was on high capacity batteries, and that one was coordinated mainly, I think, written by the Department of Energy, but also I think the Department of Defense also worked quite closely, because again, it has a lot of both civilian and non-civilian applications and importance. So when it comes to the sort of, I guess, Atlantic cooperation, I do still think that nuclear is one of the important areas. I understand that different, governments and different societies have, constraints and different, approach. But to the extent that there are all these countries on continents that are still really, do not have nuclear capacity, that are interested and already speaking to potential suppliers from, state-driven, countries such as Russia and China. It's not like if we don't really engage them, they won't go, they won't look into nuclear. So I think to the extent that, we still have operational safety culture experience and a lot of non-proliferation leadership, together with international organizations such as IAEA, and we have, both Washington and Brussels to some extent, and perhaps, Paris, and, and other governments in Europe have a lot to contribute. So I think that's I guess, the immediate dual use area of cooperation that comes to my mind for now. Thanks.
Many thanks, Jane, because especially it's a kind of tricky question. So it was, the improvisation, it has some charms, and maybe Loyle, you would like also to add some points on it.
Yeah, no, thank you very much for your question. Thank you for your comments, Jane. I think for Germany, it's dual use is a bit of a foreign concept, I think, for the Germans, especially the German political establishment, because they were, as I mentioned before, up until the Russian troops actively crossed into Ukraine, they were saying Nord Stream was essentially a political or like an economic thing, an economic pipeline. It's not really any kind of hard security at all. That's kind of warmongering, aggressive thinking from blah 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 blah, hardcore analysts, Russophobes, all that stuff. So I think the concept of dual use, it's not that Germany hadn't engaged with it beforehand, but I don't think that it really sunk in until you're kind of forced to see what the actual reality is. It's not, I don't know how far the conversation has moved since. I think it really depends which segment you're looking at. But I think this kind of the conversation is kind of ongoing and moving, really depending which technology you're looking at. In some cases, but I think that also goes hand in hand with the conversation of de-risking. What does that look like? So, for example, I think dual use and the risks associated with it are dependent, very, 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 there's significant factors that determine whether or not something's at risk, right? Are you concerned at something produced in China, because then your risk of being exposure to the supplies being cut off. And in the case of dual use, a lot of things do also come to supply risks, because if you're depending on a technology that is dual use, or a technology in multiple applications, whether it be military applications or economic applications, and you're relying on that, then your risk exposure is magnified if it's not just economically applicable, right? If it's military applicable, or for a key strategic industry that's very, very significant for employment, you're doubly exposed, right? So I think that double exposure is really, really where Germany is kind of coming in hand, where they're realizing that a lot of things that they might have relied on are vulnerabilities for a whole suite of segments of the economy. But I also think the social dynamics are particularly challenging, especially within the case. I mean, the Russia-Ukraine context is interesting because you do have the East Germans and the West Germans, and you do have different political sentiment within different parts of the country, and people historically from the Eastern Germany have different social upbringing, at least especially the ones that were raised, or born and raised before the 1990s. They have different political and social influences that can shape the perspective of, say, country like the United States and country like Russia, and what Russian influence and zone of or sphere of influence looks like. So I think a country like Germany is it's a bit challenging to look at the social dynamics and how dual use is actually characterized, because some people could characterize US LNG as a dual use technology or dual use thing, where you're vulnerable to American energy exports, and American political influence can manipulate you to be more hostile towards Russia or China, right? And that's not entirely unfounded. There is some merit to that conversation, because being vulnerable to an American energy system that can be weaponized against you should the political decision makers in that country decide to do so. There is some merits to that. I mean, the United States, Donald Trump did campaign on American global energy dominance, not using American energy exports. He was spouting this out in 2015 and 2016. This is not unnew, but it's a matter of degrees, and American tanks aren't exactly rolling into Ukraine. So I think that you're not comparing the same things in that point. And I think a matter of recognizing where threats are and what's actually at risk, and kind of scaling and giving things proportional response and appropriate degrees of importance and prioritization is where the conversation in Germany is evolving at the point. And this can be seen kind of oscillating back and forth, where you have on any number of issues, because Germany is still going through this, I would say, I don't want to say political ideological shift, but that because that wouldn't really justify it in its entirety, but it's really reassessing its posture on almost every different policy, and sometimes it'll overcorrect and then uncorrect, and then it's kind of going back and forth. And you can see this on defense, you can see this on energy, you can see this on fiscal policy, you can see this on everything. So I think that where that has landed is not exactly sure, but it won't be decided anytime soon, and it won't be consistent and across any sector anytime soon. But the conversation is definitely evolving in Germany. Sorry for less certainty, but
no, that's actually perfect. I mean, it really summarized that basically it's an evolving situation, and pretty fastly as well, and it's pretty versatile still, and so therefore actually it's a very interesting point also to end on, because as we all know, all good things must come to an end, and especially I could discuss about it. I mean, basically for the audience as well, this webinar is recorded, and we'll be able also to have some replay. And I'm pretty sure actually if we have some further questions or anything, all of you might be also reachable to talk more about it. And so from my side, I would say firstly a huge thank you to you. I mean to the speakers firstly, and to Jane and Loyle, and also Nicolas, of course, who is not here anymore. But it has been for me a really great pleasure, and I think we had a huge, I mean, some couple of very interesting takeaway messages actually we can also have. And maybe the first one is also that we have more consensus maybe in the concept actually of energy security that we might think about. And also working, I mean, cooperation is, I mean, there is a willingness actually for cooperation and competition as well. So, and it's actually good to know that we are more or less on the same vibe. And now, let's say this way, we have to see how the things are evolving. But from now, I would like to also thank the US Embassy for hosting and for their support actually to give this opportunity actually to talk about it, to discuss this topic. So many thanks for that. And I will wish you actually, I have to wish you a very good day or afternoon wherever you are, and also take care, and I would say see you soon then.